This is Invested in Climate with Jason Rissman. I see climate as the world's biggest, most diverse, most important movement in human history. Millions of people dedicate themselves every day to protecting the planet. This podcast shares conversations with advocates, entrepreneurs, investors, policy experts, and anyone else that can push our thinking about what's possible and what needs to happen to address climate change. If you have ideas for episodes or feedback, get in touch on LinkedIn. If you enjoy the show, please leave a rating on Apple or Spotify. I'm currently building a new venture. It's related to storytelling and how we engage all sorts of folks in meaningful climate action. If you have expertise in this area, big ideas, or examples of something that's really working, get in touch. Thanks for listening and for doing whatever it is you're doing to support climate progress. Okay, let's get started.
For those companies that are seeking government funding now, I personally believe that it really needs to speak to, obviously, this administration's priorities, but also address the following. So the economics, first and foremost, because sustainable alone, and certainly sustainable at a premium, is not going to sell. Has to be price parity or better.
Hey, Joel, how's it going?
It's going great.
Good to see you. I guess you didn't have enough of Invested in Climate after our interview last month?
I guess not.
Well, it was great speaking with you and starting to understand the world of non-dilutive funding for climate. As we mentioned on that episode was our first in a series on the topic. Given the changes in the federal government and the importance of grant funding for climate startups, it felt important we do a deep dive on this topic, and I'm thrilled that you raised your hand to help create this series and actually to guest host them.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely excited about the opportunity to provide a window into what I consider a really critical part of the climate sector that really doesn't have a lot of great informational resources, and where I found that people mostly learn by doing, which is definitely not the most efficient way. So I wanted to do some deep dives into topics that don't often get discussed with grant-related content and have guests to really provide fantastic insights that will be immediately actionable for a variety of folks, founders, investors, other stakeholders at both the tactical and strategic level. And I think, as you said, this is especially important at this time where climate grants are really in transition and people are trying to figure out how to stay ahead of the curve.
Fantastic. This is the first in the follow-up for the series. Tell us who you wanted to interview and why you wanted to feature them.
So yeah, for this episode, I first spoke with Tinia Pina, who's the founder and CEO of Re-Nuble, and she's done a really incredible job of raising millions of dollars in grants for her ag tech company to supplement millions of dollars in equity investment that she's raised. We also had Dimitry Gershenson, the co-founder and CEO of Enduring Planet, which provides fractional finance support and working capital, including working capital secured by grants, for many leading climate startups. We had a great conversation about grants from a founder's perspective, how companies should think about integrating grants and other forms of non-dilutive funding into their fundraising and business strategies, and really got to dig deeply into a lot of different facets and nuances of effectively pursuing and using grants for your business.
Fantastic. Thanks, Joel. Dimitry is actually an old friend of the podcast and was one of our first episodes way back when. So I'm excited to hear what he's been learning at Enduring Planet, as well as to get to learn about Tinia and all that you cover in this first deep dive. Joel, thank you again for creating this episode. I'm sure it'll inspire others interested in creating series with us. Without any further ado, let's hear it.
Tinia and Dimitry, welcome to Invested in Climate. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just to get into it, I've known both of you for years, Dimitry actually over a decade, and you both have very interesting and varied backgrounds. And I actually think that having that type of background, it really makes for the best founders. So I'd love to start off by hearing a bit about that, as well as what your companies do now. So starting with Tinia, can you just tell us a bit about Re-Nuble, its history, and what led you up to founding the company?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having us, or I would say gleefully, us both. So my name is Tinia Pina. I'm the founder at Re-Nuble. And at Re-Nuble, we take waste along the food supply chain. And as circular innovators, we turn them into biological fertilizers and grow media, alternatives essentially to peat and soil for commercial agriculture, as well as consumer gardeners. The company was first founded and started in 2015 We did raise through an accelerator that initial pre-seed highest risk capital from SOS Ventures. And then since then, we've raised roughly 12 million. Now, granted, 4.6 was from the USDA Climate Smart Commodities Partnership Program that has been currently frozen through the Trump administration. But I would say we're probably an even split between non-dilutive and dilutive dollars based on how we raise in our strategy. The reason why I started Re-Nuble was really to basically take this concept of circularity that can be sourced from food waste, especially as more people are living close to urban areas. How can we leverage the value of food waste more than just compost? And knowing that we would be living in a resource scarce environment, whether it's arable land, water, inputs, fertilizers largely imported into North America, I wanted to use food waste as a higher value add that would have just as much efficacy as some of the synthetic alternatives for indoor growers. So that's our beachhead market right now, but we also serve open field as well as consumer gardeners. And so really it's around circularity and trying to add as much value while also enabling those that grow food in a more nutritionally dense, safe, and just ethically minded way. I'll go ahead and transition to Dimitry.
Thanks. And Joel, thanks again for having us both. So Enduring Planet is a financial services company in the climate space. We have the fun privilege of being both a venture-backed company and an investor, which is a weird dynamic, but we lean into it. We provide working capital finance to climate companies. We leverage technology to make that process faster, more efficient, more equitable. We primarily lend against government contracts. So folks who either have big grants or sell to government or develop projects for the government, we can lend against any of those. City, state, federal, doesn't really matter. We're comfortable across the board. And then over the last about 15 months, we launched our fractional CFO platform for climate companies. So we provide basically a full suite of finance back office support to climate entrepreneurs, accounting, FP&A, grant reporting, modeling, dashboards, account payable, account receivable, like you name it. Basically all of the finance back office. We now serve over 40 companies in the space. So that business has been growing faster than even I had anticipated. We have now done over 60 transactions with over 40 companies in the space, deployed about $20 million. And for us, the core mission across all of this work is making sure that climate entrepreneurs have the capital they need to be successful. For us, that's the biggest motivator, is that if you look at the climate crisis, you look at how the industry is developing, there are substantial gaps in the capital ecosystem to support the transition that we need. It's not the transition we want, it's the transition we need. And so if we want to stay below, 2, now probably 3 degrees Celsius, the only way to do that is to make sure that mountains of money move into climate at a pace that is commensurate with that transition. I won't pretend to say that Enduring Planet will do that. It's trillions of dollars. But I think between showing to institutional asset managers that this is an asset class worth participating in, which then prompts the creation of 50 other enduring planets on the lending side, and making sure that climate companies have best-in-class financials so they can raise all the money that they want, we're playing our small role in ensuring that 10 trillion a year actually comes into the space on the timeline that's necessary.
Thank you both for that. And with all of the trillions that need to come into the space, I think that non-dilutive funding plays a really critical role, in particular grants. And so wanted to cover both of those things today. I think plays a role that's unique to the climate ecosystem and climate startups. So you mentioned the USDA grant that you received, Tinia, and you've obviously done a really good job of leveraging those grants to support your company's growth, notwithstanding some of the more recent developments with the administration. Obviously, you made the decision to go after grants as part of your capital stack. So can you just talk a little bit about what the strategic considerations were when you were developing a funding strategy that integrated those different forms of funding?
Yeah, it's a good question because I spoke to our beachhead market, which are indoor growers. So traditionally, that's thinking greenhouses, vertical farms, anything in a closed structure that is grown with more predictable conditions. Serving open field or soil farms was always part of our outlook. It was a bit visionary in the sense of it wasn't until maybe 3 or maybe 5 years from now that we would be servicing that market. So when we first thought of the Climate Smart Commodities Partnership Program, that was with the mindset of it would allow us to enter that market, specifically serving open field farms sooner, because building relationships with farmers takes a lot more time. And not only to build the relationship before you even talk about product, but also being able to sell into. Sometimes, depending on the crop commodity and the area and the region and the soil characterization, it can be 3 years just to get that single farm to fully utilize that solution that you're selling. So this was a way that we were strategically thinking of, if our priorities as a business right now is looking at waste streams, helping farms use these waste streams to turn it into different products. And whether we do that at our facility using those waste streams or do it at the site of the farm, it's still delivering value. And we had enough conversations with farms of all sizes, for coming from all geographies and all crop commodities, to know that they were interested in doing something with their waste. They just hadn't been presented with a business model that would serve them more than what they're seeing being served in the market. So you do have to think ahead of time. At least what has served as an advantage for us is incorporating your strategy and being a bit more earlier on your vision, because as long as you can validate that the market wants it, then through that program, the government was willing to fund it. Now, for those companies that are seeking government funding now, I personally believe that it really needs to speak to, obviously, this administration's priorities, but also address the following. So the economics first and foremost, because sustainable alone, and certainly sustainable at a premium, is not going to sell. Has to be price parity or better. Pollutant reduction, that still remains a priority for farms in or outside of the grant program that we were a part of. But showing any climate tech company that wants to be able to use grant funding, that is certainly a priority that I think is shared amongst many programs. Energy supply chain security, I would say that's second in priority compared to economics, because if you can show a solution, it doesn't matter the product or service, if you can show a solution that is reducing the supply chain, providing more guarantee or risk mitigation of receipt of supply, because a lot of things being imported right now are not getting the volume despite demand here in the US. And then 3, being more economical compared to what is being imported. That supply chain security is definitely, I would say, trumping a lot of priorities given the tariff situation as well. And then lastly, from a global regulatory compliance, if you can address regulatory tailwinds that are happening outside of North America, that has certainly been getting a lot of traction just based on conversations that I'm having. To be more succinct, Joel, I would say when applying to these grants, you have to be like, how does it fit into your business model today, but also future mindset? And also use it as, the problem is, like, even with this grant funding program, we weren't certain if we were going to get it. We didn't know until a year and a half afterwards. So you use it as a way to increase your options in terms of funding sourcing, but don't ever put yourself in a position to be dependent on it. And I would end with that.
We've now funded dozens of companies who have used grants to either open up new markets, drive core R&D. Grants can be leveraged across businesses for everything from product development to commercialization to deployment, especially today, right? There's probably more grants available for climate companies than ever before, even with who knows what happens with the federal government. But across state and city government, there's a lot of opportunity for climate companies to leverage these types of funds. And I think Tinia hit on this point that I think is really important, which is that in some ways have to build your strategy around grants, but you can't depend on them. And that's the hard needle for founders to thread, is to say, okay, I'm going to go after this funding. It's pretty material. It will likely significantly change my business, but I can't really plan around it. And you can do things to make that funding more secure, right? So you can work with someone like Climate Finance Solutions, who has 90-something% hit rate. Yeah, you'll probably get that money, but it's never guaranteed. And so I think the thing that actually helps a lot of entrepreneurs is to really carefully contingency plan, and to actually, on whether it's in a spreadsheet or on paper or whatever, to model out what are those scenarios. So I get this grant and I get my equity funding. I don't get the grant, but I get my equity funding. I don't get either. What do those look like? Where will I cut where will I invest? And I think oftentimes people don't take that secondary step and really plan carefully to say, okay, if I get this grant, but XYZ happens, then these are the choices I will have to make. And this is the timeline on which I will have to make them. And then the other thing that I think a lot of people don't plan for, which is the core of our business, is like, okay, well, I won this grant, but it's a reimbursement grant and it's a 180-day reimbursement cycle. I didn't plan to have the funds to spend on my subcontractors or my equipment purchases. And then I don't have the liquidity to wait. And so I think also making sure that you actually prepare for the cash flow challenges of public funding early is also really important. And a lot of people, what they do is they're like, well, I just have equity money. I'll just use that. But that's like the most expensive money that you have. And honestly, if you can get working capital against a government contract, what that means is it actually acts as insurance. Because now you can use your equity capital down the line when you run out of cash. You can't borrow money against a contract when you're out of cash. You can only do it when you have money in the door already. Because no lender is going to lend you money. If you're going to be insolvent in a month, they're not going to lend you money on a 12-month horizon so that you can get repaid by the grant 9, 10, 12 months down the line if you're not solvent. And so these are like, I think a lot of the considerations that founders don't necessarily think through when they apply for public funding, but they're really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's why we always encourage our clients to think about an integrated fundraising strategy and why it's important to really understand the dynamics of all the different types of funding that is available to you and also the interplay of how they can work together and each mitigate the drawbacks of the other. One of the things that people talk about a lot is maybe mostly people who haven't gotten grants before is that they say that grants are quote unquote free money. And that is not exactly the case. It is a uniquely appropriate form of funding that's patient and risk tolerant for climate founders. But it is certainly not free. Maybe, Tinia, you can talk a little bit about the challenges that you've encountered with this type of funding and maybe what the most challenging parts of the grant process have been.
We underestimated how much administrative time was required of the contract. We were only approved like for a super lean team in terms of staff to administer the contract. So I am signatory and my time on that was 30%. I'll be honest with you, it's been more than that in the past. That has since calmed down a lot. At a high level, I think just understanding what all is involved for the data collection, especially for the USDA contract, it was all the administrative time, because depending on the program, they may not reimburse you for indirect expenses to fully recoup that administrative time effectively. And then lastly, looking at, okay, at the end of the project or end of the contract, what are the total requirements that you are obligated to afterwards? And so these are all things that really have to be combed through very closely that I think founders, we want to move quickly. We see the dollars ahead of us and we just want to get the money in. But you really have to think, are you properly staffed? Do you have the right capabilities? Are you given enough budget to effectively execute on this? And if not, how much is your own company absorbing, especially if it's not, from what I've seen, it can be a distraction for founders. So if it's not something relevant to your vision now or in the near future, I would definitely discourage it.
There's a consideration for post-award management, both when you're selecting the grants, identifying and selecting the grants that you're going to go after. There are things that you can do throughout the application process to make it easier on yourself, whether that is indirect rates or properly accounting for time. Dimitry, I know that your team has the capability of supporting post-award management on the financial side as well. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that and maybe some pitfalls on that side of things that founders might encounter.
It's always really painful to see founders who have won a grant, spent months negotiating their contract. They are all gung-ho. They submit their first invoice and 60 days later it gets bounced back because it's got errors and the reporting isn't right. And then it's another 60 to 90 days to get it fixed. And then by the time they get their first money, it ends up being like 9 or sometimes 12 months later. And that can be just brutal, especially if you don't have working capital finance supporting you through that time. And I think that most often what we see is that people just fail to do their homework to understand what the reporting requirements are during contracting, negotiating those requirements as much as possible, right? So there's often wiggle room where people can say, oh, like, you want this within 30 days. Can I get it to you within 60 days? Some of those things can be massaged to give yourself a little bit extra space, but then also sitting down with your existing finance provider, your existing accounting firm, your ops team, your controller, whoever is involved in this process, and being like, hey, over the next 12 months, these are the requirements. Are we ready? Do our systems comply? So for example, what a lot of people don't realize is that in order for you to report on federal funding, well, I mean, it depends on the agency, but most agencies require your accounting to comply with something called DCAA for compliance. It's actually an entirely different structure for your accounting system, like where things are allocated, how they're named. There are conventions around your chart of accounts, and you may actually need to redo your entire accounting system just to be compliant with the grant. But people don't understand that. And so they'll submit reporting, they'll submit their financials, and people will be like, what am I looking at? This isn't even right. And so what we do for clients is we sit down with them and we're like, hey, if you want a chart of accounts that's going to get approved every time when you do reporting, let's just redo it now. And it's easier. We'll just do it for you, right? Now, in some cases, what you can do is if you have a complex and big enough business, you can create a subsidiary that is the applicant for the grant. And the subsidiary can follow one chart of account framework, and your topco can follow a different one. And that can be okay. And that can make it easier if you're like, well, I have a $50 million business. Why am I going to redo my entire accounting system just to be compliant? You might not have to, but you actually have to make that decision even before you apply, because the applicant entity that receives the grant needs to be the one that is compliant. And so I think like oftentimes people go into this process, again, it's like, oh, it's free money. Yeah, it's easy. I'll get the money and I'll just send them invoices and everything will be fine. That's not the case. But you can save yourself a lot of pain and headache by just getting ahead of it. And we see this also with investor reporting, just like day-to-day financial operations of a business. People leave the like what I would call FinOps side of startups often to last. And it is such a mistake because it's so easy to do right, relatively inexpensive to do right. And it's so painful when you do it wrong later. Because like the last thing you want is to be like, hey, I'm raising money right now. We're doing $1 million ARR, but your accounting shows that you're only doing 750. You just lied to investors. They're going to laugh you out of the room. Somebody might even say like, are you trying to defraud us? And I will tell you, I've seen that more than once.
Not every founder is an expert in everything or can be an expert in everything. And I think, as you say, one way to get ahead of things is to work with consultants like Dimitry, like us at Climate Finance Solutions. And we were really honored to support Tinia in the USDA grant that she was talking about. So I wonder if you can speak to the benefits of working with a consultant, Tinia, and maybe some lessons learned from that process as well.
I think you and your team, Joel, are really good about taking sometimes abstract ideas that it may or may not be completely fleshed out on paper. And thankfully ours was, but we couldn't be more thankful as to how expeditiously you all really put it in the structure, the language, and prioritizing how it was written based on the priorities of the grant at that time. It was always part of something on our roadmap. There was early ideas when we were working with Rod on your team. He was able to ask the right questions to flesh it out. And when founders or companies have a dedicated person from point A to point B from the grant writing process, it just allows for a very continuous, streamlined process. So that would be one suggestion I would have is the person that ultimately, let's say, has authority of the grant writing process with a consultant like your team really should own it, because I've seen when working with multiple contacts, it just causes way too much follow-up, and there's people having a misrepresentation of how things are being communicated. And that just really creates where a lot of inaccuracies and just inefficiencies. So a consultant, in short, I think just unlocks a lot of value. They know how these types of grants work, and they know how the reviewer, what they're going to be looking for. There are AI solutions, right? We've been pitched, but the AI solution is you're still going to have to invest a lot of time to do the same thing a consultant would. So I'd much rather work with someone that can handhold the process with me because they're the expert on it and I'm not.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's important to work with someone who doesn't just take your idea, assuming it's fully fledged, and just write it down in the way that the agency is looking for, but really have someone, as you said, to ask the right questions, help with project design and project scoping and strategic partnership development even. Those human elements are important, and not all consultants can do that. So it is important to, when you're selecting who to work with, to screen for that as well. Changing gears a little bit here, I think one thing that has been something that I've really admired about both of you and many of our other clients is your integrity and orientation to the mission. And I think all three of us do what we do because we think it's important and impactful. But I think my personal belief is that it's ultimately good for the company's bottom line as well to operate in that manner. So I'd love to hear how both of you think creating a values-driven business contributes to its success and what lessons other founders can take from that.
Man, I could probably spend an entire podcast just talking about this question. I spent a lot of my career working in places that on paper were values-driven, but in practice were not. I worked at Facebook for 5 years. Lots of values written on the wall, and none of them are real. And I think that at its core, purpose of having corporate values is that they enable you to make better decisions. They enable you to attract and retain the right talent. They enable you to build relationships with other value-driven organizations. And all of those things are important to your success. I think that oftentimes what people will rotate towards when they talk about values is that like attracting and retaining talent piece. And I think that's important, sure. But I actually think the other two components are as important, if not more important, because the role of values within an organization in terms of decision-making and execution is just so material, right? And it's not just about you. It's not about like you as the founder making decisions, because oftentimes it's really hard to take your values out of it. Like you're the founder, so of course they're influencing you. It's more about actually how everyone else in your company makes decisions. How do they respond to a customer in the moment when there's some complexity or tension? How do they deal with a vendor in a moment when there's some complexity or tension? How do they manage a person who is going through something and their performance isn't up to snuff? Like whatever those things are, having very clear values as a company allows people to make those decisions without then having to go to someone else to be like, hey, how would you make this decision? Because it's clear, it's on paper. Oh, we prioritize family at this company. Cool. My direct report is having a hard time with their kid. I'm going to let them take off. I don't care. I'll just make it work. I'm not going to go to my manager and be like, can I let this person take off? Should I let them take off? Is it going to affect their performance? Like, you just make those decisions. And so I think that when we started Enduring Planet, we were very intentional that we were building a purpose-driven company. We started a public benefit corporation. Like we formed as a PBC so that social impact could be part of our mission. We regularly get asked like, hey, why don't you go do lending in defense? And we're like, because we don't. We're a climate company. Why don't you? Oh, we would love to use your CFO services. We sell AI software to developers. We're like, we don't care. I don't need you as a client. I have plenty of clients in climate. We have a focus. We have a mission. We have a set of values that we care about. The reason people come work for us is because of these values. Why would we sacrifice them for an extra bit of revenue? And so it makes a lot of those questions much simpler. And I think that if you look at history, a lot of the times when companies can get into trouble is because they supposedly have a set of values, but then they don't actually operate with them. And it creates problems within their employee base, within their compliance and regulations. It creates problems with partners and customers. Like, why bother if you can just avoid all of that by being authentic?
Your mission, vision, and values driving decision-making is so critical. And the point you made about having it on paper as well, like you do need to write them down. You need to go through the exercise of defining your mission, vision, values, and purpose and what those things are in order for it to drive your decision-making and have a consistent strategic direction.
I think it's also important that values not be defined top down. Like, it's not about you writing them down as the CEO. It's about you coming together with your team being like, what are our values? What do we care about collectively? Doing that process iteratively. Like, it's not a one and done thing. We refresh our values every year. We were 12 people when we wrote our values last time. We're 45 now. What changed? Are they the same? And I think that's important.
Absolutely.
Dimitry hit it spot on. At least for us, it's been the main reason why people continue to stay with us. I've always put it this way, where if I represent with authenticity a commitment to be someone that operates from high integrity, both with how I interact with people as partners at Re-Nuble, anyone outside of that, family, friends, my integrity is everything. And I'd like to say that I think that people really know that they can trust me, and that we kept people because I put their interest as long as aligned with my own. And so I think in an environment today where there's a lot of distrust, there's a lot of people just trying to do very transactional business and really forget how to be human or human-centered, it speaks more loudly than I think people give it credit for.
A lot of folks could learn lessons from how you've approached this. Dimitry, I know that you start, as you alluded to, with a really deep understanding of a founder's perspective, and would love to hear about how you've built customer-centered service around that understanding of founders' needs, and what needs, in particular around non-dilutive funding, are you serving that they maybe can't find elsewhere in the marketplace?
You sort of alluded to this earlier, where founders can't be perfect at everything. And I think in climate, especially, the degree of financial operational skill is actually relatively low in climate. And it makes sense, right? A lot of founders are coming from very technical backgrounds. They're coming out of national labs, engineering programs, research institutions, or they're coming out of other sort of like tech spaces, and they don't have a finance degree. Honestly, like most people with a finance degree wouldn't understand this stuff either, because oftentimes the challenge is in the nuance. It's not in the like class ChatGPT how to do this thing. Like, yeah, it'll give me an answer, but it's not enough to actually do the work. And I think that for us, we started out as a lender, solely as a lender, and we were addressing a need that we saw in the market, which is like people need to work capital finance in the space, especially at earlier stages, and nobody does that. There's very few lenders in climate, in a lot of spaces, that are willing to lend to a 3-person team with a grant coming out of a national lab. Like, it doesn't happen. And so we built our business around that. And I think over time, what we saw was that a lot of folks were coming to us with requests for funding, and we'd be like, cool, show us your cash flow plan for the next 2 years. And they're like, what do you mean? And we're like, how are you thinking about your solvency? How are you thinking about having enough money to do the work you want to do? And they're like, well, we're just going along. Or people would come to us and they're like, yeah, we want to borrow money, but we don't have an accounting system. We're like, how do you understand where your money goes every month? And they're like, we just look at our bank account. And it's like, I'm sorry, but that's not enough. And it's not even really enough to like file your taxes and maintain good standing. It's not enough as an entrepreneur. Like, I've had people come to us who are like, I just raised my seed round and I'm setting up my accounting for the first time. And I'm like, you've been operating for 2.5 years. How did investors look at you and say, oh, yes, we will invest equity dollars into a business where we don't even know what's on the balance sheet? And so a big eye opener. And we said, okay, well, why don't we change this? Why don't we show up and build like a finance operations business that's tailored to climate entrepreneurs, where no, we won't just like give you a cookie cutter chart of accounts. We'll build it around your business. No, we won't just build a financial model for you that looks like every other financial model. Like, we will build it tailored to your business.
And Tinia, along those lines, how have you had to change or adapt the way you're doing finances in terms of like operationally or accounting with having grants?
The USDA, as I mentioned, the Climate Smart Commodities Partnership Program was frozen. We were awarded a second one that isn't public yet, that prioritizes input manufacturing specifically for domestic production here in the US. So we're working on that now. To answer your question, it's made us think, okay, well, of our core business, the products that we sell, how can we ramp up revenue sooner, which would mean pulling forward perhaps some products that we were going to roll out later this year, pulling that sooner so that we actually start realizing revenue from those sales sooner than what we were originally projecting. And that type of thinking of just like Dimitry mentioned earlier, the scenario planning of if the grant comes in, what does our projections look like? If it does not, what does our projections look like? The worst case scenario, there's no money from sales, grant money, or investors or debt financing like Indoor Planet. What does that scenario look like? And to be frankly honest with you, I didn't have that type of mindset until working with some of our investors and encountering some of those challenges this year. I would think that our books are clean. We'd always done projections 3 and 5 years, but the what if scenarios in every situation or circumstance, we really didn't do that more heavily until this year. Again, just thinking about how you can sell products sooner, which other markets to expand your market size so you have greater strength and ability to sell the same product with the least path of resistance. And then just I'm always looking at grant opportunities because what we do, I'm grateful that there are opportunities that exist, whether it's waste management, circularity, agriculture, but always assuming the what if scenario, if the grant money isn't in, where else can I get money from? Ideally prioritizing what's in your control, which is product sales. And if not, working with great companies like Enduring Planet or others to give you some optionality.
And I think it's even more important, I think, in this environment to be doing that strategic planning and putting rigor around not only financial planning, but business planning and operational as well. And I think a lot of that is due to what's happening with the new federal administration, certainly creating upheaval and uncertainty really across the climate sector, with climate grants being maybe one of the highlights or lowlights, I guess you could say, in terms of being the most adversely affected or one of the most adversely affected areas. The discourse around climate grants being over is certainly not the case. There are a lot of other places to get climate grants other than the federal government, and there will still be money coming out of the federal government, but there's just still a lot of uncertainty. And I know that you both have unique firsthand perspectives from different vantage points on what's been happening with the federal grant system, not only the ones that are forthcoming, but also grants that are awarded and contracted. So would really love to hear a little bit more about what you're experiencing and seeing in that area right now. And Tinia, you talked about the funding freeze, so maybe we can start there.
Yeah, I mean, this was the FPEP program, Fertilizer Expansion Production Program, that we had applied for roughly maybe 2 years ago, and then just received recent news about it. At the local level, statewide, there's a lot of great institutions. One of them is NYSERDA, is a great example of state-based funding. California has a lot of great state-based agencies as well that are still supporting climate work, agricultural work, energy. So I would first focus on local, is what I mean by that. State, I think county and city has reduced their ability to provide non-dilutive funding, but that doesn't mean that philanthropic hasn't. And what I have been hearing is that, and this is through some investor channels, that there is more redirect, especially as it relates to climate tech or more green focused ventures, to allocate more money towards philanthropic because of the diverted priorities of this administration.
Yeah. And in terms of what's been happening with your grant in particular, I don't know what you can share about that, but maybe at a high level, what's been going on there?
Yeah, it was officially frozen, I think, January. We were anticipating some rumblings of that what if scenario in December and even late November, given some of the pushback and I would say resistance to the IRA Act and what it has funded. The USDA Climate Smart Commodities program was definitely funded by the IRA Act. And so right now, there was 2 funding pools. The largest projects were funded in the first pool. The second project, which were smaller and focused on small producers that were rural, is what we were part of. And we haven't heard anything definitive. I'm not aware of any contracts in our funding pool that have been terminated, but everything's been frozen. So there is, without giving specifics, anywhere between $500,000 or upwards of funding that hasn't been paid for expenses incurred in 2025. For some of the projects are seeking lawsuits to try to recover. And I'm not sure if they came in as a class action type lawsuit or what, but that was what I've heard recently as of yesterday.
I know, Dimitry, you mentioned that you do a lot of lending against grants. What have you been hearing from your clients and others?
We've only had a couple borrowers have their grants terminated. Both were international related, USAID, TDA. Both companies have ways. In the case of most federal contract terminations, as soon as the contract's formally terminated, the agency has to pay you for expenses incurred up until the point of the freeze or the termination. And folks who have spent money against a grant should expect to get their payments. Now, whether or not the federal government will honor those obligations at this time, I think is an open question. I have faith in our legal system to say, hey, like contract law still applies. That doesn't mean that folks won't lose out on future revenue that they had planned for. But at the very least, money that they've spent to date should be reimbursed. We are seeing folks with DOE and DOD grants get paid. So funding is flowing, but it's often much slower than planned. And I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is that folks who got notices of award aren't getting contracted. And so like they won the grant, but they can't get the contract. They don't actually have the grant. And I think that's the really challenging part right now for a lot of folks. I would also echo Tinia's point about making sure that you are really taking advantage of all the local opportunities. Cities, San Francisco, New York, LA have grant programs in climate, especially around underrepresented communities. And then state programs, you mentioned NYSERDA, California Energy Commission, Cal Fire, Cal Recycle, lots of California agencies. Mass CEC is a big grant provider, Massachusetts, programs in Washington, Oregon, like everywhere. And I have a feeling that those are going to grow pretty materially in the next few years as states respond to the federal change in agenda.
Yeah, some governors have already announced that they're going to be increasing climate funding. Gavin Newsom in California, for example. I would also just make the point, and not every company can move to Europe or deploy in Europe in the near term, but there is a lot of climate grant funding in Europe, and that's not going away anytime soon. We have, at CFS, we've always been a global company, and we've been doing more and more work in Europe over the last year even, and certainly that's accelerated through basically since the election. So to the extent that if you have the ability to deploy in Europe, or if it's on your roadmap in a couple of years, we never want to encourage people to chase grant funding off of their roadmap. That's like the worst thing that you can do. But you may consider looking at the landscape in Europe and moving some of your timelines up if grant funding is a core part of your strategy. To wrap up here, there's a lot to be concerned about right now, some of which we just touched on, but I think there's also just a lot of bright spots in climate. I know that for me, the incredible team that I have at CFS and the really amazing, innovative clients that we get to work with every single day really help keep me feeling positive. My wife and baby daughter help as well. So just quickly for each of you, what's keeping you hopeful right now?
Great question. I appreciate ending on that. I'm always an optimist. I think what behooves a founder in this type of environment is always being resilient. And I think some would think that, oh, well, why are you applying for this opportunity if it's not immediate, if it's not one of your 3 goals for this quarter? It's because of the what if, right? I'm not sure when this may pan out, if it may pan out, but if it's part of our trajectory, why not? It has always served me well by thinking that way, just as well as if there's a capability of us providing a product that doesn't require any more resources, any more for marketing, CapEx or otherwise, and we can easily produce it from the same resources that we currently have, why not consider that as a back card in your back pocket type option for selling something? The reason why I say that is because I think in this world, in the world that we're living in, both now and in the future, being adaptive is like the biggest strength one can have. And so the more options that you have, doesn't mean you need to execute on all of them, but just having a plan for what ifs and potential options that doesn't require more resources, I think the more agile, in my opinion, that's always been a strength.
I have worked in climate for 15 years, and I'm pretty used to it being hard and often depressing. Like saving the world is a pretty strong motivator. I also think that it helps to get to work with really incredible companies doing amazing things every day. We've now worked with over 100 climate startups and SMBs doing everything from composting in Colorado to advanced battery technology material development. Like, it's just such a fun ride. And then sometimes you just got to let go and enjoy the things that are closer to you. And so, Joel, I think you and I both share this, but like my kid's 7, she's like just such a joy. And there are really tough times I can just go home and be like, why don't I just snuggle with this incredible human who loves me and doesn't care about this deal or this customer, or none of that matters. And I think that helps too.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you both for ending on that note and for being here in the great conversation. I think both of you have such important perspectives for climate founders and also other folks in the ecosystem to hear. So really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joel. And thanks, Tinia. Good to
Thank
chat, always.
Likewise.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Invested in Climate. Please remember to rate us on Apple, Spotify, or Google. Find show notes, sign up for updates, get in touch, and visualize your climate action at investedinclimate.com. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, accounting, or legal advice. Thanks again.